In an address to members of the IMF and the World Bank in 1981, former American President Ronald Reagan said that, quote, "The societies that have achieved the most spectacular, broad-based progress are neither the most tightly controlled nor the biggest in size, nor the wealthiest in natural resources. No, what unites them all is their willingness to believe in the magic of the marketplace." The glorification of free markets and simultaneous vilification of any kind of government intervention in the economy constitute a pernicious attitude that exerts a lot of influence in many parts of the world. The belief that markets work perfectly on their own and any sort of governmental meddling in the economy is inherently detrimental resides deep in the minds of free market dogmatists. And to their credit, there are a lot of positive things to be said about free markets and the potential they have to bring about prosperity. But before diving into markets as a matter of principle, I want to take a look at some empirical examples. The poster child for free market advocacy is none other than the world's second largest economy, that of China. Since it opened up its economy in 1978, a point up to which centrally planned policies had caused nothing but stagnation, inefficiency, and economic isolation, China has achieved one of the highest GDP growth rates in the world, attaining a yearly average of 10%, and has lifted up 800 million people out of poverty, a truly historical feat. It has also seen significant improvements in access to health, education, and other important services, rapidly transforming itself from a poor and inefficient third-world country to one of the world's major economic powers in a span of just 3 decades. Similarly, all the way across the Pacific, the miracle of Chile is often cited as another example of the power of the free market. In the early 70s, arguably as a result of price controls, excessive public ownership of resources, and protectionist policies, inflation in this South American country was soaring at a jaw-dropping rate of 150%. It was plagued with instability and a devastating poverty rate well north of 40%. In the midst of this economic Armageddon, the infamous General Augusto Pinochet carried out a coup on the then left-leaning president Salvador Allende, subsequently giving rise to one of the most brutal dictatorships in Latin American history. A dictatorship that, despite its heinous human rights abuses, was very much focused on economic prosperity, or so it claimed at least. After the turbulent political displacement of the democratically elected president, Pinochet brought a group of economists who had studied under the renowned Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. They were informally referred to as the Chicago Boys. As ministers and cabinet members of the new government, they advocated for laissez-faire policies, dismantling most forms of government intervention, welfare expenditures, and deregulating banks. They did as much as they could to keep the state at bay from the vibrant, vigorous, and highly efficient market. Lo and behold, the country quadrupled its per capita income in a span of 30 years. Its poverty rate fell from 40% in the 1970s to less than 10% by 2019. Beyond the political shortcomings of the Pinochet regime and some economic difficulties Chile faced down the line, sympathizers argue that a great deal of the changes that were made in the mid and late 1970s have been kept and largely explain the country's current prosperous position as one of the greatest economies in the region. As the former finance minister Alejandro Foxley put in an interview in 1991, he said, quote, "We might not like the government that came before us, but they did many things right. We have inherited an economy that is an asset," unquote. So what's all the fuzz about? If the evidence points to the conclusion that state intervention must be gotten rid of to achieve prosperity, why even argue about this? The problem is that despite these isolated cases, the evidence runs largely against the case for free markets. As much as China and Chile are touted as prime examples of the power of laissez-faire economics, excessive market liberalization has caused an overwhelming amount of harm in many countries and has arguably exacerbated economic inequality. If you acquaint yourself with the prevailing discourse in right-wing American politics, for instance, you'll run into an argument colloquially known as trickle-down economics. The idea is that if you deregulate large companies and corporations by taxing them less, the higher profits they'll be able to earn as a result of the decreased tax rate will work as an incentive for them to expand their businesses, creating more jobs and employment, and ultimately helping those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. The newly created wealth at the top of the distribution will trickle down to the poor and will result in shared prosperity. It turns out that Reagan did try this in the 1980s, and the results were suboptimal to say the least. While there was some economic growth, the entirety of the benefits were received by those at the top of the income ladder, while those at the bottom not only didn't receive any benefits, but in fact saw their incomes decline. All of this took place in tandem with a tripling rise in national debt, which went from $995 billion to $2.9 trillion. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz puts it, "It is not true that a rising tide lifts all boats. Sometimes a quickly rising tide, especially when accompanied by a storm, dashes weaker boats against the shore, smashing them into smithereens." Unquote. Another example of the devastating effects of markets is that of the 1997 East Asia crisis. By the time of its unraveling, the East Asian countries of South Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand had experienced unprecedented economic growth, with real GDP growth rates in the ballpark of 10%, gradually opening their economies over the years while protecting certain national industries which were deemed vulnerable to global competition. They were astutely able to use the hand of government to partially direct their destinies. But of course, all good things must eventually come to an end. In the case of this historically remarkable trend, it all came crumbling down when these countries, under pressure from the IMF, decided to liberalize their capital markets and seize all intervention in capital flows. This led to speculation and a belief that their currencies were overpriced, causing massive capital outflows and sending their economies into an intractable downward spiral. As Joseph Stiglitz writes, quote, "I believe that capital account liberalization was the single most important factor leading to the crisis. Crisis that beyond numbers and figures meant a great deal of suffering for people who lost their job, went bankrupt, and weathered severe adversity. Had the East Asian governments been allowed to interfere in the economy and control the amount of foreign money that entered their countries, the crisis could have been, if not avoided, ameliorated." There are countless other empirical examples of market failures, but in addition to empirical limitations, there are also certain problems with markets as a matter of principle. You see, free market advocates believe that in addition to free markets being the most efficient way of distributing resources, they are also the most democratic and moral way to do so. They claim that markets enhance and are compatible with the values and rights of individualism, freedom, and human dignity. But they fail to recognize that despite all the material prosperity markets can bring about, they have an inherent feature which can, and often does, become problematic, namely inequality. They forget that insofar as there are certain groups of people who have abundant access to goods and services, and conversely, groups of people that live in the withering abjection of scarcity, there will be an ever-present threat to the latter's political rights and to the preservation of the values the libertarians hold so dearly. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy writes, in a society in which most goods and services are distributed through markets, those who do not have the means for purchasing them can be said to be free only in a very restricted sense. A strict system of private property rights can lead to situations of extreme inequality in which some members of a society are left to starve, so that it becomes questionable in what sense they can be called free. This presents defenders of markets on a priori grounds with a choice. They either have to bite this bullet and accept extreme inequality and poverty as justified, or they have to step back from their pure a priori position and admit that consequences can play a role in the consideration of markets. There admittedly are definitional debates to be had about the meaning of the notion of freedom. Right-leaning individuals respond by using the seemingly restricted notion of negative freedom, or freedom from, as in freedom from government intervention and coercion. Such conception is unfortunately too narrow and fails to include other ways in which the meaning of freedom has been historically interpreted, such as positive freedom, or freedom to, as in freedom to do something, having the capacity to carry out a given action in addition to being free from coercion. Above all the quibbles and arguments one might have concerning markets as such, the chief mistake that seems to be made in these discussions is the adoption of the assumption that markets are isolated networks, that the political, social, and economic spheres operate separately, and that the dynamics that take place in one of these dimensions cannot bleed into the others. This leads to an economic outlook lacking in perspective and blind to the interdependent nature of rights and economic relations. This is it for today. I would love to know your thoughts on this and the potential agreements or disagreements you might have. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Hope you have a wonderful day.